we're not going to force businesses closed. We're going to let them collaborate with their knowledge, with their on the ground information. Maybe some of them will reduce their hours and they'll coordinate when they do that. And maybe your neighbor will get this for you, and maybe and that sort of thing. And the thing is, you would have had less economic damage then, because people would have known, people know what their most essential trips are. The government doesn't know that your most essential trips are the same for everybody and the little list that you provide. Right. And so that alone, when you start multiplying at times, billions of decisions, really reduces the economic damage. But in terms of the sheltering in place, which was never going to be perfect anyway, it gets you about the same result.
Can I pause for a second and just note that we got Brian on here who's getting Congressman Massey on, and our typical lineup includes like homeless people that believe in Bigfoot.
Welcome to the Brian Nichols Show, your source for common sense politics on the We Are Libertarians Network. The Brian Nichols Show is the fastest growing liberty podcast that brings together people from all means of political thought as we seek to have meaningful conversations about the issues you care about. At the Brian Nichols Show, our goal is to leave the audience educated, enlightened, and informed. And now your host, Brian Nichols.
Happy Monday, folks. Brian Nichols here on The Brian Nichols Show. Thank you for joining us on another fun-filled episode. And if you're a YouTube listener, well, guess what? You are in store for the 8 p.m. premiere of The Brian Nichols Show here on Sunday, the day before it airs over on the audio version. So for you audio listener, let's go. Go ahead, hit that YouTube button and hit the notification bell so you're not missing every single episode that airs here on the program. And today, starting things off with Max Gulker. Max is a great friend and a returning guest here on the Brian Nichols Show. And the discussion today is the lockdowns, but not in the way that you're used to here at the program, but rather about the messaging on the lockdowns. Max thinks maybe we went a little too far. Maybe we should have approached the lockdowns a little more not in the ferocity that as libertarians did. I push back a little bit, but I think you're going to leave the conversation definitely feeling some value, because this is a conversation we've been seeing had throughout the entirety of the libertarian movement here over the past year, especially. So a great chance to dig into some of those differences of views, differences of perspectives. Overall, a great conversation to be had. So with that being said, on to the show, Max Gulker, returning to the Brian Nichols Show.
Thank you so much. I'm glad to be here on video. This is my fourth or fifth time we've done this, although like it was audio before.
Yeah, and almost all of our episodes always end up going pretty darn high in terms of the download numbers, because folks are interested to hear an economist's take in terms of how libertarians would handle certain things. So, Max,
well, I like to think of myself as a friend of the show. So,
absolutely.
We'll see if on video people want to download me quite as much. But
hey, you were over on Matt Kibbe's program, and you had the video version there too. I don't think that
is true. That is true. How have you been able to keep your glasses on with masks, by the way? Because I have not. I've quit wearing my glasses because they fall off anytime I have to put on a mask.
It's a pain. No, it's seriously a pain. And candidly, I'm at the point now where if I'm out and about, I'm not really going into too many stores without a mask on, just because in Philadelphia, they do have rules. I respect private property. Like if they say please enter without or with a mask on, I'm gonna respect that. But when we're outside walking around, I'm not gonna be wearing a mask. I'm sorry.
I generally don't either. I'll just because this is relevant for this day and age. I'll tell you a quick story, which is that I was a little late in getting masks, when this started, and not because of politics, but because I'm me and I just procrastinate. But one day I'm in this tiny little grocery store in tiny Hillsdale, New York, with these really short aisles, and I pass this woman, this old lady in a mask, and she looks at me terrified. And I was like, you know what? Right or wrong, I don't want to terrify this woman. And so I got the mask.
Yeah, and I'm at the point too where I was also not wanting to terrify people, but as things started to get more and more obvious, and I think really for me and a lot of people was when we saw the protests take place over the summer, and we saw people outside in massive numbers, and cases didn't skyrocket. It was like, okay, if you're outside, you're going to be okay, and that's where I think people started to realize you could make calculated decisions, calculated risks. And it's funny here, we're already kind of just segueing into the conversations. I know one of the things we were discussing, and you've kind of taken a little issue with is how we've had the conversation about the lockdowns and how a
Right.
lot of people are maybe more hesitant just based on the conditioning that they've had to experience through the mainstream media. I mean,
Right.
I saw the crazy Gallup poll that if you were a Democrat, you on average had I think it was a 70% more likelihood of thinking that COVID, you were like that you either
Right.
you knew somebody who got COVID or somebody who died of COVID or the severity of COVID. I forget the specifics, but that number 70% higher. That speaks to how there's a group of people out there who I would say they're looking to be afraid and have those fears covered by somebody, and in this case, covered by government.
Right.
So, Max, help me out here. Tell me what your take is in a better approach of dealing with these COVID, the COVID narrative, right?
Well, I think that one thing that I don't know if it disappointed me, but because I don't know if I was surprised, but it was unfortunate, is we found a way with this to have to just project the same onto the same arguments we always have, the same thing. This shouldn't, in theory, be related to whether you're conservative, liberal, libertarian, socialist. It's not. It's a virus, and yet somehow we found a way to do it. Now, there's lots you can blame on that. There's people's assumption that government is supposed to save them. At the same time, government is very involved in our lives right now. We may not like that, but we haven't convinced our democracy of that necessarily yet. There might be reasons why that's unfair, or the media, is tilted a certain way. But I think there was, on every side, there was a lot of sort of assuming, being shocked that the other side would think the way they did, which is funny because we tend to always have the same arguments. So, after that, I think if libertarians made, in my view, maybe one mistake, and let me try to explain why I think this is a mistake. It's a general habit we have that's called that I like to call "it's not that badism," right? Which is that the first time we ever talked was about climate change and stuff, and I said, "Look, this." For a long time, the sort of party line was that it either wasn't happening or it wasn't, that bad. And to me, that wasn't a libertarian point. That was a scientific argument. Now, if you think that sort of, the deck is stacked against you, I could see how that, becomes resonant. But to me, the question was always, how do we, attack this and solve this? And are there private solutions? And to me, controlling this virus, people say, oh, it would have been, impossible or too hard for private solutions. To me, it was also a challenge for central planning, right? Because that doesn't seem to have done all that well either. And, similarly with the environment, similarly with, and so I think that, had we, the question with a pandemic is, what does a private response to a pandemic look like? And if this pandemic wasn't that bad, well, we know there's other pandemics in history that have been bad. So again, is that a libertarian point, or is that just a point about this pandemic? So I would like to, see us, especially those of us, I don't really consider myself an academic. I'm kind of halfway between that and a commentator, but I'd like us to think about what that response looks like and talk to people about that kind of thing a little bit more. And I think maybe as folks like you are out there kind of directly on the ground getting involved in politics, maybe you start telling stories about where government went wrong, and where if we let people make their own decisions and have individual freedom, maybe things would have been handled better. And, I have my ideas about that, but, maybe you do too. And I'd love to hear those.
Yeah. Well, so the one thing you mentioned, the mistake, is that of it wasn't that badism. So
yeah.
I don't know if that's necessarily, I think, fair,
Mm-hmm.
because I think when we start off looking at originally at the beginning of the pandemic, and you look at my
Mm-hmm.
show, Tom Woods, I mean, Dave Smith,
Right.
go through the big libertarian channels, I think it was
Right.
pretty much understood that this was a virus that a lot of people didn't know what
Right.
was going on, but
Right.
it seemed to be that it was impacting older people
Right.
or people with comorbidities and
Right.
people who were obese or overweight more frequently.
Right.
And that seemed to
Right.
be pretty safe to assume from the onset.
Mhm.
But even to say that was looked at as if it wasn't being taken seriously, but it's more so just trying to identify
Right.
the reality. And I think it's important because if we're not going to set the stage by looking at what the actual facts are, you do see a situation where you have folks who they do think that it's 70% worse than it actually is. And that's
Right.
where it impacts real policy. Because what
Right.
happened is we still have areas, I live here in Philadelphia, that,
Right.
that you're still in a semi-lockdown state. And
Right.
is it necessary? Is a lockdown from an economic standpoint a necessary thing to be done to help contain a virus?
Right.
And we're seeing across the board, no. So
Right.
I say all that because it was because we weren't allowed to really
Right.
question the mainstream narrative that was being pushed down from the
Right.
federal government and from a lot of these very, like New York State went right
Right.
into lockdown mode instantly. And
Right.
and if you weren't allowed to question that, because if you did
Mhm.
question it, you were told you want people to die, or you're questioning the experts, you're questioning the science, TM,
Mhm.
right? Like, and that's where I think we had a lot of people who said, well, hold on, if we're not allowed
Mhm.
to question this, can we at least ask why?
Right.
But then we were told no. And I
Right.
think that's where a lot of folks have gotten more and more weary as we've
I
seen
agree.
just an acceptance of a narrative despite it being fundamentally not true
Yeah.
at its base.
Right. I'll tell you it's something that I find interesting is that, and when we talk about the lockdowns, we talk about them as sort of one thing, as kind of the government flicking a switch and shutting everybody down. And I think there's a lot, especially for libertarians, to learn. It's actually very good news for libertarians with respect to kind of looking at it a little bit more from what a hero to libertarian economist, Ludwig von Mises, called methodological individualism, right? Which he said, man acts, right? Now, what does that mean? It means, right, it's individuals that act. When we think about groups, sometimes we like to personify them like they're people. We like to say the state or the billionaires or Wall Street or that kind of thing. But those are thousands of people interacting, and sometimes we miss a lot. We misunderstand a lot when we don't do that. So, like, for instance, my former colleague, Will Luther, who works at the Sound Money Project at AIER, wrote a paper very early on using some preliminary data where he showed that, the shelter-in-place orders were not the only input to people choosing to shelter in place, right? Because they started before the order went into effect. Now, you can't separate the fact that they expected an order to go into effect, but to me, so if you look at everything the government does is bad and say, well, sheltering in place must be bad, then, that's sort of bad news. But if you look at it as that's a precautionary measure that that a lot of people are going to take anyway, then did you really need the government to issue an order, to make a law about that? Or did you need, I made a joke that you could replace the government with a mass email, right? You could, if you just got the info. Now, this would take a long time because, again, people have come to be sort of reliant on this as an authority in their lives, and that we have to undo that in a way. And I think that there's that appeals to people in some ways, but they also don't kind of understand how that would work. But in this case, now that we live in a world, we like to talk about how social media screws this up and creates echo chambers and stuff. It also can disseminate information very fast. You can hear from your friends who you trust about these things. And so, to whatever, again, this is less about did the lockdowns work? That's another debate. But assuming they did help, that information could have been passed along sort of person to person in a way that it couldn't have even been 20 years ago. And I think in general, that's really good news for libertarians. And finally, to me, the big mistake and the coercive, anti-market, anti-economic mistake the government made was really shutting down the businesses because, I don't like it when some, including many of my friends, call this house arrest, right? Because, nobody was sticking. I left my house every day, right? They said we could. They said you go to essential places, but there's the rub, right? They closed, they took away because they couldn't enforce keeping everybody in their houses. Right? What's the next best thing you can do? You can take away everywhere somebody has to go.
But Max,
and that's where the real harm was to me.
So just to play devil's advocate, though, because
yeah.
if you look right now, I mean, we're recording here on the 21st. Candidly, sneak behind the curtain, folks. We're recording a little early, but you're looking at what's happening in Ontario, Canada. I mean, they are though arresting people for being outside, and I think that's a very real concern that we need to be addressing because if for some reason we were to continue to see this narrative embraced as it being the end all be all of human existence, then of course people want to make the most dramatic actions, in this case,
and that's
reactions.
What our political system.
Right. So, but isn't that necessarily important for us to make sure that we're correcting the narratives from the onset, right? To make sure that, that's not necessarily a argument saying we shouldn't be talking to people and helping like build the solutions. I agree with that. But also when you do see things that are just factually incorrect, to at least address them.
Right. No, and that is very true. And we have a responsibility to do that. Everybody has a responsibility to do that. I'll come back with a cautionary note about that in a second. But in terms of, we didn't see that happen quite as much, the sort of coerciveness with people in their homes in this country. We're lucky that could have happened. My concern, that kind of echoes your concern, is that now that we have this technology where we can see viruses coming that are, and I don't want to trivialize this for anybody who lost somebody or got really sick, but are medium bad in a way, that are sort of worse than the flu we're used to, but are also not the bubonic plague that's going to be, remembered for thousands of years, right? We can see these things coming. The question is now, is everything we see coming going to be treated as this, horror story waiting to happen, which obviously it won't be. Obviously, on average, most things are going to not be quite as bad as this. Even if really quick, there's so many mistakes people made, and I'm sorry I keep jumping from this. I keep thinking of another one I want to say because,
but really quick, because I do see though part of the concern that I had from the beginning was that the arguments that we're seeing being used for the pandemic are already being used to address the very thing that you were first on the program for, and that was climate change. So we're seeing that just because the narrative has been set on is like, this is the framing, right? So in sales, we talk about when you're framing the conversation, this is pre-framing to saying, well, we did it for this. Why can't we do it for this? Right. And can't we all make this little sacrifice? That's setting people into a mindset, which, I mean, can't we call it for what it is?
So I'm gonna make a point that I think is going to surprise a lot of people, which is that I think if you look at this from the other direction, from the not perfect compliance, this is actually really bad news for things like the Green New Deal, which says, we want to reduce our use of, these greenhouse gases by 100% in 50 years, or we have 12 years to do this and we're all going to die, right? And which, if we hadn't seeded all that ground, that would look that would look more obviously ridiculous to more people. It looks obviously ridiculous to me. But, there's this sort of myth out there that this whole thing could have been perfect, right? That if there had just been, if these people on TV, if these libertarians or these MAGA people just wore their masks, right, then everything would have been perfect. And that's not true, because even if the masks and the social distancing work, they don't cut cases by 100%. And second, it's systemic that those things aren't going to be perfectly complied with, right? Everybody's been outside when you forget to wear your mask or you forget to put it up, and guess what? The most ardent left-wing or Andrew Cuomo supporter forgot their mask at some point too. And so these things can't be perfect. I think one of the myths that our political system proved incapable of dealing with, at least at like a state or a national level, was that this was never going to be perfect, right? Because if one side said that, then the other side would have made hay about it, and we would have, and the first side would have suffered politically. So we could never really be totally honest about that. That's a little bit of why I don't like It's Not That Badism here, because I think instead, if we had said this isn't going to be perfect, then here's the way you avoid at least a decent amount of the economic damage that happened without, and you still, have people not mill about as much, is you make it voluntary, but you disseminate information, you work with people, and you say, hey, why don't you try to cut your trips outside your house for this month by 80 to 90%? But we're not going to force businesses closed. We're going to let them collaborate with their knowledge, with their on-the-ground information. Maybe some of them will reduce their hours and they'll coordinate when they do that. And maybe your neighbor will get this for you. And maybe and that sort of thing. And the thing is, you would have had less economic damage then because people would have known, people know what their most essential trips are. The government doesn't know that your most essential trips are the same for everybody and the little list that you provide. Right. And so that alone, when you start multiplying it times, billions of decisions, really reduces the economic damage. But in terms of the sheltering in place, which was never going to be perfect anyway, it gets you about the same result. Now, the problem is that would have involved honesty about the fact that this was never going to be perfect and there were always going to be risks, which politicians didn't want to say. And so that proved impossible. But right there, that's a way that the sort of assumptions that a lot of people make, I think we both think faultily, that the government is the entity that has to be responsible for all of this, really leads us astray. You got when you ask these as big questions. Yeah, that was, I think, the most confusing thing to a lot of people. Because if you had said to people, how many lives would you save if you just didn't drive this year, right? It might have been, it would probably be an astonishing looking number if you looked at it at a national level. But we've decided to take those risks, and we've decided that conscientious individual choices are how we're going to handle that, because even if there's, sort of denial among some people out there and they don't want to admit it, it's not perfect. But in that situation, they're used to doing one thing. So I would have friends who would sit there and say, well, we can't, when the vaccinations started to happen, and especially when the older folks got vaccinated, who were really the ones this was brutal on, is they'd say, well, we still have to, do everything exactly the same. But then you'd see that they were a little less careful with their masks, and maybe they didn't put them on as much, and maybe they went out a lot more, and maybe they were comfortable with that. And so it was hard for people to sort of say that and kind of, and I don't think your point is well taken about what you couldn't say in the beginning. I think this is something different, which is people are in sort of denial about these risks. But if you look at their sort of individual behavior, they're less worried, and that may be part of the adjustment process. That may be a way that some people let go of this, is sort of Max, slowly like that.
But they vote, though. They vote differently.
Right.
And that's maybe, so this is, and you know this, you're an economist, right? So people obviously are going to act differently than they're going to say that they'd act, right? So
right, but they are going to vote that, yeah.
Right. So and that's something that I think is being maybe a little underlooked at, because when they do go and vote, there is real life policy implications that, for, in this case, much worse, end up causing more harm than good. So I think it's great to say we need to build these solutions, but it's also just as important to identify in this case. So if we're looking at it from a sales perspective, right? If you're going in and you're looking at government as the incumbent vendor in this case, you have to go through and establish what the pain point is. What is this issue that's going to make the person go from where they are now to this better future? And then it's on us to, again, yes, to your point, present that other solution, but we do have to make sure we're effectively articulating what the actual problem is. And part of the problem has been, and I don't think it can really be denied. Part of the problem has been the way that people have voted, and people end up voting a lot based on the way that they're approaching politics in the emotional aspect, right? Because they've been so conditioned in many cases to get very fearful of not just what's out there in the unknown, but now just their people that they live with, the people that are around them, their fellow man. You're just supposed to look at people just with your eyes and not be able to see, are they smiling behind the mask? And it's made it very, to a point that we're almost desensitized to each other, I think. And it goes right into the mindset of just divide and conquer. So I say all that because I want to know, Max, like, what can we do? And I'll say from your perspective to better present not just the solutions, but also making sure you were still effectively addressing the original problem. And that is, in this case, the manner in which people are voting and the policy that's coming from those votes.
So I think one of the things that we can better address is that individual freedom and the government leaving you alone doesn't mean you don't look out for other people, right? It doesn't mean you don't cooperate. It doesn't mean, and so one mistake I think a lot of my friends made was focusing so much on the masks, because frankly, of all the damaging things in all of this, I don't think the masks were that high on the list. They weren't fun to wear, but it's a compelling piece of symbolism, but it alienates just as many people as it energizes. And in the end, I don't know what the economic cost, at least, of that was. Whereas the business closures, the the school closures, the impact on kids, I think that is, this is, again, something where I don't want to minimize the impact of this, but if you took a survey of elementary school kids, grandparents and great-grandparents, and asked them, would you accept a little bit more risk so that your kid can go back to school? My guess is a huge majority of them would say yes. And that doesn't mean that we should treat, their risk, casually or that sort of thing. But that was one of the things when my list of things, of points about this and things that were missed was getting too long. One of them was, one thing that was missing that I keep saying was heterogeneity across the board. The fact that we had to treat everybody the same. And I'll tell you who that screwed over more than anybody else was poor people, especially in big cities, and people in nursing homes. Them actually first, vulnerable populations and like urban poor housing second, because those were the people who were most likely to get the disease at home, right? Because they lived in dense conditions in the home, right? And because we couldn't, part of it is sort of the expert's fault, right? Because just like in our econometric models, their epidemiological models sort of, it gets too complicated when you try to put everybody's different kind of living condition and really model it and quantify it and that sort of thing. So that's part of the sort of self-fulfilling prophecy of treating everybody the same. But that and then when we see those kinds of things and poor people getting screwed over by that to the left, here's what happens. Is I started reading these magazine articles this summer from the left where they would say things like, well, we have to focus on building more equitable cities in the future. And I was thinking, like, the people in like housing projects right now don't have time to wait for your more equitable cities. Okay? So maybe like give them an extra bottle of Lysol. And that might help more than you're daydreaming about what equitable city you're going to build that's not going to work anyway. And I didn't see much of that. I can't say for sure that there was none of that, of, sort of efforts to say, well, these people are living in the kind of housing they are, so what should they be doing differently to sort of stop the spread than, me living alone in a big apartment or something like that. But I didn't see very much of it. It wasn't sort of um, the thing that politicians kind of got rewarded for here, which is a big problem, I think. And that's where a lot of the deaths came from, frankly, from nursing homes, from the urban poor, that kind of thing. If you had allowed for the fact that those people were in different circumstances, instead of saying it's unacceptable that they're in different circumstances, so 30 years down the road we better make sure that that cost lives, frankly, that kind of attitude of we can't accept that they're in different circumstances, because you're not going to change that over the lifespan of a pandemic.
So I think
and so you're going to save lives by being real about that sort of thing.
Yeah. Oh, I think as you were talking, I'm figuring it out, because originally what sparked this conversation was I had tweeted, if you're explaining, you're losing, right? And you kind of took a little issue with that.
I said we got to talk about that, because I couldn't disagree more. But I think we may have to talk about different things.
Right. But I do think it kind of goes into maybe exactly though this point, because here's maybe the problem is that when this started and the COVID pandemic started, you weren't allowed not only to ask the question, but the explanations weren't real. and people just weren't explaining things because there was no real rhyme or reason to what we were doing. It was more so, we don't know what's going on, time out. And as data came out, states like Florida, I mean, Governor DeSantis has pretty much gone on the record of being one of the best governors looking at the actual data. I mean, he was working with the signers of the Great Barrington Declaration pretty much before any other governor, because he was trying to follow what was actually happening, and he protected the nursing homes primarily. And that's why Florida, despite being one of the oldest states and one of the more populated states, is kind of middle of the pack in terms of their overall COVID cases and deaths. So I think part of it is because we as libertarians inherently want to explain things, because we know that it sometimes can be hard to understand the ideas that we believe. But I don't think sometimes that's the best way to get people to want to be curious. I think partly that's why being so bold against the lockdowns from the onset would have been, and I still think is, the best way to get people to say, well, tell me more about this libertarian party. Not so much because we're saying we don't think that people, that their safety or security matter, but rather that we know the implications, and it gets people to ask more questions, but also entering into the conversations where people already are at. So, I mean, maybe that's where I think if you are explaining your losing comes more into some context. So maybe I'd like to hear your reaction there, Max, to that.
Right. So one difference in background between the two of us is you're involved much more directly in politics and in sort of engaging voters, and I'm an economist, right? I'm supposed to be this egghead studying numbers, and actually I am a lot more political than a lot of sort of academic economists, but to me, my first instinct was not to fight for something here. My first instinct was to step back and watch and learn. And so that doesn't mean that the Libertarian Party shouldn't have done that. I won't apologize for allowing myself to be in the wilderness on this a little bit, because I think you do come to new understandings, and I think you can do it better in the future. Part of the reason I won't cast stones that people didn't do that immediately is it happened so fast. And frankly, I wish I could go back in time and write papers about what private responses to this would look like, and show people that there were other options, because I do think that at times all we could say was no. And I do think that no response to this would not necessarily have been the best course. I don't think the lockdowns as they were the best course. But again, this was not, would people say 1918 or the flu epidemics that happened in the 60s, technology is so different now that we had options open to us that we never had before. So nobody ever had to answer questions like, do this many million or 100,000 people die, or do you not go out to dinner for 18 months? Now, that sounds really trivial when you sort of put it like that, but when you multiply those dinners and everything else by everybody, and you start looking at the mental toll of it, and you start, that's when to me, that's a problem with collectivism, with collectivizing that question, with making it so big, is that you could say that about many things, many of the risks we take in modern society. When you step out into, a city and there's lots of traffic, or you drive a car, or you get the flu, or there are lots of things that if you sort of collectivize to that point, it would be hard for people to say, oh, well, we shouldn't just stay home, but we choose not to. And I do think that actually at this point, this transcends politics. I think that once the people who were the most vulnerable to this, namely elderly people or people with some condition that made them more vulnerable, got their vaccinations, I think a lot of the talk remained, in being locked down, and maybe in Philly it is locked down, much less so here. And I at least noticed that people were much more willing to go out once, when my 72-year-old mother was vaccinated, who was, the person in that age group who I saw the most at that point. I was at that point, before that, I was more conscientious and careful. I'm still conscientious and careful, but I was much more willing to go out because, again, I think that my risk profile in this, it may be worse than the flu, or maybe but it's closer to 2019 than it is to 2020. And, there's no such thing as zero risk, when you live your life, when you step outside your door. And so, at that point, I think it disappoints me from from the lockdown supporters then at that point that they're trying to put the brakes on that, because I think at that point, we're back in a world where conscientious individual decisions are what we've always let govern those things, which for a reason, because we can still live our lives at that point and not go insane sitting in houses for a year. But it's I keep saying I think Anthony Fauci is afraid to not be on TV anymore. I think that, and that's even, that's a human thing. Maybe when you go through a really intense year and that's what you're doing, you sort of like get used to it. And because it seems at times like he's clinging to like, oh, we still got to do this when, maybe we don't. I thought the FDA, this was a good moment for libertarians. When the FDA, out of an abundance of caution, said no Johnson & Johnson vaccine, people were mad. I saw very few people support that. My very left-wing mother said this is ridiculous, and so I think that was a moment when people, I think that was a successful teachable moment in a way where people saw that maybe a government agency had different incentives. If you work for the FDA, and 10 people die because of a vaccine, maybe you lose your job or something like that. And, even if that's totally wrong, but your incentive becomes minimizing the number of people who die from a vaccine. Now, that's good in isolation, but that's not the only thing that's happening in the world, right? And in fact, that will almost surely cost more lives in COVID, just given how few people, struggled with that vaccine. And so I think that was a moment where the government was exposed a little bit in a way that people almost couldn't argue with. And because then it's not a political story and it's not the sort of satisfying confirmation bias kind of story. If you were someone who was very pro lockdown and you said these darn libertarians and MAGA hat wearers aren't wearing their masks, if you were slated to get that Johnson & Johnson vaccine and you couldn't get it, and now you're not going to get anything else for 2 months, you're pissed off, right? Your first response is not going to be to weave it into a political story. And that's not, that's not something that's unique to one side, but that's a personal, story. And again, which is something we've touched on a few times here, and that it's important for me, it's important for you, it's important for all of us in the way we communicate to do that a little more.
Well, Max Gulker, unfortunately, we are already at the time where we have to get ready to say goodbye. So for the folks who are watching, I know time goes so
there were like
fast.
9 more topics we were supposed to talk about, but I guess
I know
we're
already at like 40 minutes. It happens fast, so we'll have to make sure we have you back in the program. But for folks who YouTubes, they can see here at the bottom at MaxG_Econ, and we will make sure as well that for folks who are looking to find that in the traditional show notes, that will be available as well. But Max, with that being said, let's go ahead and give you the last word here in the program. If you can leave the audience with any words of wisdom.
Oh, that's like telling someone to be funny. It gets very hard to be funny when you do that. Just don't assume that people. There's no better way to learn than to look at people who disagree with you and not assume they're stupid and evil and figure out why they might disagree with you. That doesn't mean you have to change your mind. That doesn't mean you have to put your principles on the line. I was pushed on Twitter on something yesterday when I was criticizing the fact that marijuana laws are such that I feel like states are more monopolizing it rather than legalizing it. They're sort of becoming the monopoly pot dealers in a way. And that you could argue that's a step in the right direction, especially if arrests go down, and that's fine. But somebody pushed me on that in a way that I thought was wrong, but it helped me understand why I thought I was right more. If I only got likes and retweets from that might feel really good, right? But listen to the people out there who disagree with you. It's not going to make you less principled. It's going to make you stronger in how you understand your own principles if you do it with curiosity. That's my best. That's what I got.
I like it. Max Gulker, as always, a fantastic conversation. Thank you so much for joining the program, and we'll make sure we have you back on for part 2 of this conversation because it's just the tip of the iceberg. But as always, thank you so much, Max.
I think I've reached friend of the show status, so anytime you want me.
For sure. Max Gulker, thanks for joining the program.
I always appreciate it, Brian. Thank you.
Alrighty, folks, that's going to wrap up my conversation with Max Gulker. I really appreciate it. Thank you, Max, for joining the program. This is the conversation that we need to be having, and I think this is the conversation we're seeing more libertarians having, how we're going to actually go out and speak to people in order to change hearts and minds. And I'm hoping that as we have more of these conversations, we can look to point to examples of what's been working. I know we've been having a lot of success here in reaching people. So folks, as you're going out and having the conversations like Max and I were having today with folks outside of our movement, I would love to hear about it. So please go ahead and make sure you share those stories with yours truly. And you can tag me at bnicholsliberty, Twitter, Facebook, minds.com, and parlor.com, or email me, brian@briannicholsshow.com. Also, if you've not had the chance yet, of course, this is a video program as well. So head over to the YouTube version. You can check out the program a day before everybody else, 8 p.m. Eastern time, the day before the traditional episode airs. So make sure you head over there, hit that subscribe button, that little bell, and also give every single episode a like. I greatly appreciate it. Also, Apple Podcasts, if you haven't yet, give us a 5-star rating and review. Tell folks why you get value out of the program. And yes, of course, our Patreon is alive and well. And for $5 a month, you can become an entry-level member of the Brian Nichols Show supporting listeners group. And every single supporting listener gets, you can see it over my shoulder, but I'll pop it up here on screen a little bit easier for you to see, one of these amazing Don't Hurt People, Don't Hurt People, Don't Take People's Stuff bumper sticker. It's a fantastic way to get people to ask some questions and say, will you tell me more? And of course, we Liberty folk, we love to tell people more. Some housekeeping. Did you get the chance to check out yours truly over on the Naturalist Capitalist with Reed Coverdale? We talked about selling liberty. How can we meet people where they're at? It was a great conversation with Reed. Thank you, Reed, for having me over on the program. Also, I had the chance, and we talked about it here for the past few months, I had the chance to go ahead and moderate an amazing panel over at microdose.buzz, The Heroic Dose. We talked about psychedelics as an alternative form of therapy to those both in the military, but also first responders groups who desperately need help. PTSD, depression, anxiety. It is an unspoken pandemic that is taking place right now with our military personnel. A terrifying stat, by the way. 5,000 troops, I believe it was, had passed away. I forget the time frame in the war over, I think it was in Iraq. Since then, those troops, though, we've had 100,000 veteran suicides. This is a conversation that nobody's having, and if they are, they're not having an opportunity to have a loud platform. So for the chance to have folks on the program who both were having use those different forms of therapeutic drugs, psychedelics, psilocybin, ibogaine, and so forth, it was great to learn. And that's candidly how I think we are able to best help other people, is to help them realize that they're learning without realizing that they're learning. That's how I know a lot of us joined the Liberty Movement, is something was sparked inside us and it made us want to learn more. And that's how we need to be approaching things as well, folks, not going out and preaching, but rather trying to get people to ask more questions, to ask why. Tell me more. And that's something I think we had a great chance to go ahead and do with that conversation that we had back here on Thursday with Microdose. Now, coming up here on Wednesday, I'm very excited. You get to hear from one of our awesome sponsors here in the show, and it's kind of sticking into this same realm of alternative forms of medicine. Addison Todd, he is the CEO, founder, and chief poobah over at Eables.com. That's right, E-A-B-L-E-S, Eables. That's right, folks. You get to meet the guy behind Eables, as well as Delta 8 THC. We get to learn what is Delta 8 and how has that entered into the marketplace, and how could you possibly go ahead and help support a sponsor of the show, also supporting the program and get Delta 8 delivered right to your door? What? Yeah, you're going to have to go ahead and make sure you learn more by hitting subscribe so you're not missing our awesome episode airing here on Wednesday, and for you video listener on Tuesday night. So with that being said, folks, thank you so much. Go ahead, check out my conversation with Reed Coverdale over on his YouTube channel, The Naturalist Capitalist. But with that being said, folks, it's Brian Nichols signing off here on The Brian Nichols Show for Max Gulker. We'll see you Wednesday.
Thanks for listening to The Brian Nichols Show. Find more episodes at briannicholsshow.com.